Testing 1, 2, 3. Let me know if anyone can hear me. I'll just talk for a little bit here, get everyone time to settle in. Good evening. My name is Nicholas Bernhard, and I am the director and producer of the movie Blackstone's Equation, the Tim Masters story, which is a documentary about the wrongful conviction of Tim Masters and the murder of Peggy Hetrick. Let's see here. Let's check on things. I usually like to wait until I get some feedback on what the audio is like. But I haven't shown this in a while, and I'm very excited to be screening it again. I think it's the Tim Masters case is the most unusual case of wrongful conviction that I have ever come across. And okay, let me check up the volume a little bit more. I'm going to turn it up here. Let me know how this is. As I was saying, the Tim Masters case is the most unusual case of wrongful conviction that I've come across. It's the twists and turns that are in this case. They shocked me, and they've shocked most people who've seen this movie. But there's been a renewed interest in cases like this. For example, the Netflix documentary "Making a Murderer." People have taken that was another one. In the case of the, sorry, just a moment. Sorry about that. The twists and turns in this case, I just was blown away by. And as Steve Lado talks about in the documentary, you can be a very jaded attorney, and you'll still won't believe the events that happened in this case. So let me give you a rough overview of what we're going to do tonight. First, I'll talk a little bit about the movie. Then we'll screen the documentary. It's a little under an hour. After that, I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that I learned about wrongful conviction during the course of making the movie. After that, I'll answer some frequently asked questions about the case. And then after that, we're going to have a Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can either do so in the YouTube chat here, if you have a YouTube account, or you can reach me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at ndhfilms. You could also email me at nicholas@ndhfilms.com. That's November Delta Hotel FILMS. So, to talk a little bit about Blackstone's Equation, this was something I was working on in late 2011, and I was looking for a subject to do for my next documentary. And this was going to be my first feature film. So I had heard a little bit about the Tim Masters case, and actually at the time I thought that it sounded a little bit heavy for me to do a movie about. When you do a documentary, you really live with the subject for an extended period of time, and I wasn't sure that I was up for being involved in something like this for so long. But as I researched it, the more I read about the Tim Masters case, the more fascinated I became. I've never read anything like this before, and after a few weeks of research, I realized that this was going to be my next movie. And I very much enjoyed the process of making it. I learned a tremendous amount, and it's been a real pleasure to share it around the country. I've shown it at law schools, at high schools. I've shown it to paralegal conferences. I've shown it in a theatrical release around Colorado and Kansas. And I always enjoy speaking about this movie with audiences. It's a movie that sparks conversation. And unfortunately, we don't get enough movies like that. So that's a little bit about my process, and I look forward to talking about it with you afterwards. I'm going to turn my microphone down while we're watching it, so you don't have to listen to me mumble or whatever. But I'll turn it back on after it's over, and while you're watching it, feel free to add your questions into the YouTube chat or on Twitter, and so I'll take a look at those as we're watching them, and I look forward to answering them after the movie is over. I'm going to play the movie for a couple of minutes. If the sound isn't good, let me know, and I'll stop it, and we'll try it again. All right, let's try. Let's enjoy watching Blackstone's Equation.
It's not uncommon that a prosecutor might overstep a bound or two in a case, or a judge might let a little bit too much evidence in a case, or that a jury might mishear some information in a case. But somehow everything happened in Tim's case. A lot of attorneys, they read the story of Tim Masters, and they don't believe that it's true. You can meet a lot of jaded attorneys who've been through the system and say, oh, there's no justice, all judges are bought, whatever. Doesn't matter. Even the most jaded attorney looks at Tim's case and says, I can't believe that could happen in our legal system.
I know that the justice system works when the people that are involved in it play by the rules. If everybody does their job, if everybody does it with integrity, if everybody does it with good faith, and not the need to win or lose, but the need to see the outcome be truth and justice, it works flawlessly. But when one or two players decide not to play by the rules, this is what happens.
I want to just set the scene for those of you who may not be familiar with the case and with the problem of innocence in the criminal justice system. In February of 1987, a woman named Peggy Hetrick was murdered in Fort Collins, Colorado. She'd been sexually assaulted and murdered and left in a field. An investigation ensued, of course, and among the people who was questioned, interviewed, was Tim Masters, who was, at the time, a 15-year-old kid who lived nearby. No charges were filed. The investigation continued. Tim moved on with his life, graduated from school, joined the Navy. 11 years later, Tim was arrested and charged with the crime and was prosecuted and was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Actually, that was an old case. He probably had the possibility of parole after 40 years.
I was 15 years old. I had gotten up for school. It was a normal day to me. And took a shower, had breakfast. I joke about it. I had a heart-healthy breakfast of sausage and eggs. And then about 6:50, I was out the back door, heading through the back part of our property and the field behind my house to go catch my school bus. When I hit the property line, the edge of our property line, I could just make something out. It looked like somebody had dumped trash in the field. And I remember being upset about that. And the closer I got towards the object, the more humanoid it looked. At 15 years old, to me, it looked like a Rossessa Annie doll had been placed in the field by someone playing a sick practical joke. So I Turned around, walked off, caught my school bus, and I didn't say anything to anybody about it until the police showed up at my high school. And when I saw the cops, I knew, okay, it wasn't a mannequin, it was a body. That night, my father attended a community college. He was taking a welding class on his GI Bill. Well, my father wasn't going to let anything change his routine. He wasn't missing school. 15 years old, a murder victim has been dumped in the field right by my house, and I'm all by myself. I was a little scared. I had an extensive knife collection. I broke out all those knives and put them on my dresser top. The day after I'd seen the body, I went to school like normal. And while I was at school, the police went to my house to search my room. The first thing Jim Broderick sees when he walks into my bedroom is my knife collection displayed on the top of the dresser. I wasn't there, so I can't say, but I think that's when Jim Broderick made up his mind, oh, this is the guy, we got to get this guy.
We're not stupid. We didn't bring you in this room because we're taking a wild guess out of the dark. Do you seriously think we'd waste our time doing that? Would we bring you in here without some kind of proof? Did we collect this for nothing? Did we go through your room and find all these neat things about you for nothing and all these knives? Seriously.
You know, I'll tell you what. That was a 15-hour torture interrogation. I never seen anything like it. It was a kind of interrogation that you would expect a 15-year-old kid to confess falsely to. It's been sent to the false confession people as the book on how to get a false confession. But of course, Tim didn't confess because he didn't do it.
Doesn't help to deny it.
One woman reaches out to hold the boy's hand while asking him to reaffirm his guilt.
I didn't do it, so.
Yes, you did.
I mean, really, it's the earmark. You bring in one lady and she's your girlfriend or your mother and you're slapping your hand, you hug, and I mean, it's obscene.
I read and watched every single minute of every single interrogation that Tim was subjected to. Sat through hours and hours and hours of videotape watching this 15-year-old kid being browbeaten by a team of detectives. And what I was most surprised by is how he never changed his story. There are people out there, grown men, who would crack and say, you know something? I'll sign anything you put in front of me right now if you let me go home. Or let me have a meal. Or let me see my dad. The one thing he had is that he never, ever caved. If Tim had broken down and said, okay, fine, I'll sign anything you put in front of me, he'd still be in prison. Ask him a question and say, Tim, tell us how you stabbed her. And he'd say, I didn't stab her. Then they'd say, well, if you had stabbed her, how would you have stabbed her? Well, imagine how it feels to stab somebody. Let's do a scenario where you stab somebody. Well, did you ever write about stabbing somebody? And say, well, yeah, one time I wrote I stabbed somebody. There you go. Fast forward to the trial, and they would tell the jury, we asked Tim Masters about stabbing somebody, and here's what he said. And they'd leave out the hour of questions that preceded it, where Tim kept insisting, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never stabbed anybody. I don't know what it would be like to stab anybody. I'm never going to stab anybody. And they'd say, oh yes. And Tim admitted that he thought about stabbing somebody just like this.
You're pretty good with knives, aren't you?
What do you mean?
Well, you know how to use them. You wouldn't be collecting if you didn't know how to use them.
I just like to collect them.
You do any trapping or skinning or anything like that of animals?
I never hunted with those knives. No, I did hunt, but they weren't the best knives. I was into the military. I was into the movie Rambo, and they looked like the knife Rambo had. One of them was a pretty close replica, only a lot cheaper.
Tim Masters sticks to his story and maintains his innocence. The investigators then switch gears and ask if he will submit to a polygraph.
Yesterday, did you murder that girl?
No.
Other than what you've told me during your entire life, did you ever even once hurt anyone?
No.
Are you the one who stabbed that girl?
No.
Tim Masters fails the polygraph.
Fort Collins had a polygraph examiner on their staff. He was not known to be a good polygraph examiner in that he wouldn't get results that were helpful. My belief is, if this thing was even hooked up, was not even conducting a polygraph. He knew that if he strapped the average person into it and said, we've got evidence on you, and by the way, if you lie while I get you hooked up, I can tell, because it's going to show me, and then asked, did you do it? He probably got some people to confess that way. Interestingly, in Tim's case, Ken Murray lost the charts. He later claimed that either he failed or he's inconclusive. We've actually heard both versions of that.
After Ken Murray, the cop polygrapher, came out of the room, he told a number of police officers, including Ray Martinez, homicide detective, the results were inconclusive. So I don't believe it for a minute. I have seen no proof he failed, but that's how cops do it.
It's important you tell the truth. I have told the truth. She's dead. Can you dig what I'm saying? You scared a lot of people. You scared me. I didn't sleep last night. I slept about 2 hours. You scared the hell out of me. Half the detective bureau, half my people lost all their sleep last night. We're trying to find you. Put the puzzle together. We knew who you were, but we have to put the evidence together. Things like this. Searching your room, notes. Getting a psychological profile about you. Come to grips.
When Peggy Hetrick was killed, I was actually a police officer for the city of Denver. Came back to Fort Collins in July of 1987. Some genius had come up with a plan that Timothy Masters on the anniversary date was going to act up, do something out of the ordinary. Who knows, may even go out and kill somebody else. We have detectives that are staked out at the scene where she was murdered in Fort Collins. Surveillance that's set up at the Loveland Cemetery where Peggy Hetrick had been buried. Detectives that were trailing Timothy Masters from the time he left his house until the time he got home at night. They hinted to the media that they were close to making an arrest because this was supposed to apply some sort of a psychological outburst on Masters. They were trying to psych him out, if you will.
I had graduated from college and started at the local newspaper, came on to the paper, was assigned to the Cops and Courts beat. My editor handed me a news release from the police department and said, they're saying they have a suspect, write it up. I wrote it up, made a couple of calls. They said that they suspected that it was a teenage kid. I never heard the name Tim Masters.
To make sure that he read it, they clipped it, put it in an envelope, and then put the envelope on Tim Masters' pickup truck. Just in case he wasn't a newspaper subscriber, we'll make sure that he gets the story.
And I opened this envelope up that he gave me, and it has the bogus newspaper article, photographs of Peggy Hetrick, and my mother's obituary in it.
So they weren't close to making an arrest.
Oh, heavens, no, they weren't close. That was back in, what, the late 80s? That was back in the late 80s. They didn't make an arrest until almost 10 years later.
They did the psychological experiment. The best minds of guessology and forensic speculation said he was going to do this, and he didn't do it.
I mean, they even acknowledged that maybe they'll get me to either hurt myself or hurt someone else, and if that happens, the FBI is going to deny that they had any involvement in it. It was their idea.
Have you ever seen the memo?
I haven't seen the memo.
If things go wrong, the FBI will deny any part of it. In writing. Shocking. I've never seen something like that before.
The Fort Collins police, they did a line search of the field behind my house where Peggy Hetrick's body was dumped. They didn't have the manpower to cover the whole line themselves, so they brought the sheriff's department in. The sheriffs brought these kids that went to my high school called Explorer Scouts. After the line search, they told these Explorer Scouts that I was a suspect and to stay away from Tim Masters because he's dangerous. I was the skinniest kid in the school. 5'10", 115 pounds. I would be walking down the hall, and the people would go clear to the other side of the hall to avoid me.
They let everybody know, look out. Sexual killer.
Right, they had the Explorer Scouts.
Well, they had them out looking for the nipple.
Imagine if a 14-year-old Explorer Scout finds a body part and says, hey, I got a piece of evidence here. We're going to go into court and have this child testify about what they found. I mean, it's crazy no matter how you slice it.
I enlisted in the Navy at 17 under delayed enlistment. My first duty station was the USS Constellation. My first job on there was a blue shirt on the flight deck. They controlled the aircraft, they chalked them, they chained them down. I was fairly dedicated. I was planning on making a career out of it for the first 6 years, and then 6 years into it, I saw all these 35-year-old men with gray hair stressed out because it's a stressful job working on the aircraft, making sure they're up, no one gets hurt. So I did 8 years and got out with an honorable discharge.
Tim Masters' father dies. Shortly after his obituary appears in the local newspapers, the Fort Collins Police Department miraculously decides to reopen the Tim Masters case. Tim Masters had told the police repeatedly, "I was at home that night and my father can testify to that." Well, once his father died, his father can't testify to that. And I believe that was one of the major reasons that the case got reopened when it did.
After the Navy, I went to work at Learjet in Wichita, Kansas. And I was working as a contractor, so we'd work 6 months, 9 months till the job was done. I was home on vacation, just enjoying life, and the Fort Collins police showed up at my door. I said, "What am I under arrest for?" And the detective said, I can't tell you that." And so they handcuffed me. They were about to take me out, and I told them I need my glasses. I wore glasses then. I couldn't see without the glasses, so I got them to put my glasses on me. And as I'm walking out the front door, a guy in a blue suit comes walking in and says, "Tim Masters, you're under arrest for the murder of Peggy Hetrick."
When I was called to jury duty, I had no idea what it was even about. It wasn't until we were all selected that they opened opening statements, and we knew then it was about the Peggy Hetrick murder. So when this case proceeded, and I kept waiting after all these years, I kept thinking, well, the police have come up with something, or they wouldn't have arrested Tim. Well, as the trial proceeded, I realized it was all circumstantial.
What's this? Who's dying there?
I don't know.
Well, you drew it.
I drew a lot of pictures like
Okay,
that.
well, you can remember that drawing. What is it?
It's just a guy getting sawed up.
Getting sawed up? What's up there?
It's the blade.
They sawed up. You ever think about how you always think about killing? Torturing? Knives? Someone hanging?
The police and the DAs really portrayed him as a social pariah, right? That he had no friends, he was a loner, this creepy kid. And when you don't have any evidence, that's what prosecutors do. When they don't have the evidence to convict someone, they overload the jury with sort of collateral stuff that doesn't actually have to do anything with the crime itself or the person himself.
So they just gave me the whole case file and I started reading through it. And I remember getting to the drawings and narratives and going through it and looking at the number of drawings and the nature of the drawings and just being overwhelmed with a sense of, oh my God, this is the guy that killed Peggy Hetrick.
For prosecutors, the case is a difficult one. Its strength found not in the hard stuff of physical evidence, but the intangibles of the criminal mind.
There was one of the jurors that I believe was a nurse, and there was a drawing that looked like he had a knife stuck in like a wallboard or sheetrock and was cutting through it. And in deliberations, she said, you know, I've been a nurse and I have no doubt what that is. And that she felt it was a vagina with a knife stuck in it. The drag drawing that everybody's talked about, one of the other jurors had been in Vietnam and said that that drag drawing shows that Peggy was still alive, because in the drawing her legs are bent, and that meant that she was pushing up trying to get her breath, whereas if someone was dead, the legs would have been straight.
People are fascinated with this idea that you can look at drawings, you can do interviews, you can talk to people and come up with a psychological profile that will essentially predict that someone is a killer or show that they were a killer. There's a difference between what we think would be interesting and be fun to make a movie about, what we can speculate about, and what should be allowed to be scientific evidence against someone in court.
There's a very strong argument to be made that Tim's drawings, when you show it to the average person and say, what does this prove? They'd say, well, it doesn't prove a whole lot. But if you ask them, how does this affect you emotionally? They have a very strong emotional reaction. Oh my gosh, I don't care about the facts. This kid needs to be locked up. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people on the jury who thought that, who said, well, you know, whether he did it or not, he's still not a good kid, because look at these drawings. These drawings are crazy. And that's a problem.
The only new evidence, because you know this case started in 1987, the only new evidence is Jim Broderick getting referred to Dr. Reed Malloy, who is sort of a psychologist to the stars.
Dr. Reed Malloy, an expert in the pathology of sexual homicides.
Lieutenant Broderick provided me with approximately 2,200 pages of drawings and narratives produced by this young man before and immediately after the sexual homicide.
Dr. Malloy concludes that Tim Masters lived in a fantasy world, one filled with violence, most of it directed toward women. At some point, according to Malloy, that world became Tim Masters' reality, and Peggy Hetrick became his victim.
What he did was he basically gave Tim a psychological diagnosis solely by looking at the drawings, looking at the artwork, which, by the way, is unethical. I mean, for a psychologist to basically try to diagnose somebody whom they've never met, they've never interviewed, because the psychologist that worked for the prosecution, he never met, interviewed, spoke to Tim.
Anymore, if there's really no hard physical evidence and the prosecution has to go get a professional opiner of stuff, you guys probably not guilty, you know? I'm not saying he's innocent, but he's probably not guilty. And when you read the Supreme Court opinion, you know, they basically declared Dr. Malloy, who is just a psychologist, a forensic doodle interpreter. You know, I mean, what the hell? No one's ever heard of that before.
The template is Lord of the Flies. The template is All Quiet on the Western Front. They're all based on some other story, and he just kind of would develop it. I mean, he had a story about Orphan Annie, and he developed it where he basically saves her from being raped. I mean, so what was confusing to me when I'm reading these stories that he wrote is that, well, okay, if the person who killed Peggy Hetrick, here's the fact. The reality is the person who killed Peggy Hetrick killed her with one stab wound and then cultivated her body parts that are very sexual in nature. There's not one story, not one writing, not one poem, nothing that has anything to do with what that obsession was and what the person who killed and cut out her parts. That's what that killer wanted to do.
This is the theory of stupidity, all right? Here's how you make a psychological theory that impacts the Colorado Supreme Court and Justice Rice impactfully. Tim Masters, when they ask him what the body looked like in the dim light in early morning hours, says, well, I think she had on pink socks. And then they try and make this theoretical connection leap that because his mother, when he was 11 years old, got a rapidly onsetting bacterial infection, toxic shock syndrome, because she didn't have red hair, but they say she had red hair, that would make him want to look out the window for a 38-year-old redhead woman, sneak up behind her, stab her in the back, and surgically excise her nipple and her vagina because of red. It's crazy.
Fisher or Chambers, they didn't provide any character witnesses?
No, they didn't. Their explanation for that to me was if they lost the case and had to appeal it, they didn't think any of this stuff should have came in, and they didn't want to open any doors for character evidence to come in. I know.
The prosecution spent a few days putting in their proofs, and all Tim's attorneys did was they put in one expert, and their one expert said their expert's wrong. Do we go whole hog and try to blow everything out of proportion the other way, or do we kind of like say, hey, if that's the best they got, it's no case? So I think a lot of attorneys would consider that a toss-up. You either say, you know something, their case is so weak, let's not even bother, you know, with a gigantic convoluted defense. Let's simply point out how weak their story is. We know it didn't work, but on any other day it might have worked.
One of the interrogating officers, Larry Martinez, he said he wishes the defense had asked him flat out, do you think he did it? And he would have answered no.
See, I think that's a cop-out, because what he's really saying, if you read between the lines, is I wanted to testify about something and tell the truth, but I chose not to. How is an attorney for Tim Masters supposed to know that of all these cops who are testifying, one of them will help me if I ask them the right question. I just don't know which one it is. So you can't blame the attorneys for not asking the question. The police officers, though, if they got on the stand knowing they were helping convict an innocent person, if they didn't speak up. Remember, it's not their job to get convictions. It's their job to arrest the bad guys and to get the bad guys out of society. Tim was not a bad guy. So he was part of the machine that put Tim away, and for that I fault him.
My sister was in the Army. Her specialty was nuclear, biological, chemical warfare. I want to say either December 86 or January 87. I had brought one of her books to school. It was a military manual that spoke of how to survive a nuclear war.
I believe one of the teachers testified that Tim once flew into a rage.
That was Lynette Payne, I believe.
She saw this book with pictures of nuclear bombs on the cover. She didn't know they're nuclear. She just saw the bombs on the cover, and she thought it was a book on how to make bombs. So she confiscated it from me. After class, I went up to her and I said, "Can I have that book back?" She flat out refused to return it to me. I was pissed. I walked out of class, but the worst thoughts I had were, I'm going to go slash her car tires for that. I get to the next class, and I never slashed her car tires, never did anything to her.
She was all bent out of shape about it, and so she sent him to the counselor.
She assumes that my mother's death is the root of my problems, and her theory was that I hadn't properly grieved over my mother's death because I wasn't angry at her for dying. Okay, whatever. 11, 12 years later, she's called on the stand to testify about how she was so afraid of 15-year-old Tim Masters that day.
You have to remind yourself, if you look at Tim Masters today, you see a rather burly man in his late 30s. At the time Peggy Hetrick was killed, Timothy Masters was 15, probably didn't weigh in excess of 115 pounds.
Most people who testified told me that I've talked to have said, well, we never knew. We thought there must have been more evidence. We never knew. It wasn't like the police were telling them anything exculpatory about Tim. They didn't give these witnesses the information that, for example, so Tim graduates from high school. What does he do? He goes to the Navy. What does he do when he's in the Navy? He travels all over the world. What does Broderick do? Broderick actually puts a tail on him. They tailed him, and there was no instances of any violence against women, no hooking up with prostitutes, nothing.
It bothered me that he walked up to the body and didn't report it. I think now, on this end, I realize that that's the only connection that Tim had with Peggy Hetrick.
Well, on the way to school, I was second guessing. Maybe it wasn't a mannequin, maybe it was a body, but I didn't share my problems with anybody. I didn't talk to anybody. I didn't, like some kids would have ran right to the teacher. I wasn't taught that way. My father taught us not to show our emotions to people. So, the idea of saying I think I saw a mannequin in the field, there was nobody to talk to.
The bicyclist, the adult, I think he was in his 40s, who actually reported seeing the body, also told the police and wrote it in a written statement that he thought it was a mannequin as well. There's no blood on her. She's very pale, and she looks like a Recessa Annie doll.
There were those that they didn't even need to go any further. They were convinced when they walked in the room. I had a problem with that because I felt we had a duty to the community and to Tim, because what if that had been one of my kids being accused, that we needed to go through the evidence. When I sat back, you were told to use life's experiences and your common sense and the evidence before you. That's what I was told. So when I sat in that jury room, and I used life experiences, I used my common sense, and the evidence that we were given, I came to a point in my mind, on the whole, that he did it. That he did it. Did I have some questions? Yeah.
When they finally came back with the verdict and they said guilty, I was just shocked. The newspapers, they'll say Tim Masters showed no expression when the sentence was pronounced. Yeah, because I was shocked. I never expected a guilty verdict. It's not really something you could just describe. I mean, it's loud almost all the time. Most of the time it is boring as hell. There's nothing to do and there's absolutely no joy in your life. It's beautiful all around there. You have the collegiate peaks surrounding the facility. Sometimes you even smell the mountain air and the pine trees, but in between you and that is a tall chain link fence with razor wire wrapped around the top and a guard in the tower who would shoot you if you try and leave. Usual schedule was I would get up about 5:50, go to chow when my door opened, come back to the cell, they'd lock you down again. The last few years I was working in the saddle shop making leather products, which is really ironic because I'm accused of stabbing someone to death, and then I get a prison job working with sharp knives. Just imagine the cheapest food you could feed another human. It was high in carbohydrates. We had this unusual proportion of diabetics for the population, you know.
It's culture shock to be stuck in a cell that's a few feet by a few feet, possibly sharing it with a felon. It's inhuman in many respects. There's a toilet sitting right out, in front. You got to go to the bathroom there, use that. If you get lucky enough to get a job working in the shop, for instance, you might make 50, 60 cents a day, which you can then use to buy things from the commissary that are overpriced. Do you want an AM radio that has one speaker? That's $10.
The first appeal, there were 3 judges, and then I thought our arguments are solid. I mean, you can't convict someone with stories and drawings. It's character evidence and it's forbidden. So I was shocked when the appellate court ruled 3-0 against me, supporting the conviction. And then it went on to the state court. And then they ruled 4-3 against me that the stories and drawings were harmless error. In other words, I would have still been convicted if there are no stories and drawings in the trial. Well, that was their case. So I was shocked and devastated when they did that, and by this time I have no faith in the system.
Our system isn't structured for Tim to be free. I mean, once you're in the joint, it's like I always say, the Department of Corrections doesn't give up. It's dead easy.
Tim was fortunate because he had a family on the outside that helped. He had a friend who paid, a citizen who actually saw he was featured on an A&E special, and there was a citizen who watched the A&E special. I forget what the name of it was.
Cold Case Files.
I think it was something like that.
Because that's the one I watched. And when I watched that was the first inclination. There was a lot that we hadn't been told.
Well, a private citizen named Taylor Maris had saw this show, and he told me as he was sitting through this show, he kept waiting, okay, any minute now, they're going to show the clincher where that crucial piece of evidence that allowed them to make an arrest and conviction.
With no physical evidence linking him to the crime and no witnesses, the case against Masters rests almost entirely on his drawings and the powerful insights they offer into the criminal psyche.
And the show ended and there was nothing. And Taylor was like, what? Where's the evidence? How'd you convict him? You convicted him on stories and drawings? You got to have more than that.
And so he actually paid out of his own pocket the transcripts and shipped them to Tim on his own. And so that was huge.
After his conviction was appealed, Tim began a process, a post-conviction process, a process in Colorado that we call a 35C motion to try and prove his innocence.
I spent probably the next 5 months just working on it every day, going through any law books I could find. In the prison, you don't have computers to work with. You don't even have up-to-date law books. My motion was 30 pages long itself. The appendix was 90 pages. DOC would only copy 15 pages of that. They asked me which 15 pages I wanted copied.
He filed that motion himself, and Tim at that point caught his first break in the case. Maria Lou was asked to take on the case, and Maria agreed to take on the case. And then Tim caught his second break on the case. Maria got David Wymore involved. Mr. Wymore is one of Colorado's best trial lawyers, was the capital defense leader for the public defender system for many years. They became convinced of Tim's innocence, and the question became how, in the post-conviction setting, when the presumption of innocence is gone, do you go about proving that? Well, they uncovered evidence that the prosecution had not turned over to the original defense team information that should have been turned over.
Early on, we interviewed one of the expert witnesses that they had contacted, a plastic surgeon in Fort Collins. He said this would have been a very difficult cut for him to make. He said it would have taken really good lighting. The prosecution's theory was that it happened out in the field.
The cut to the breast, that's kind of his area. He said it was done by a right-handed person, and their theory was Tim was left-handed. That you'd have to have good light, and this was allegedly done out in a field in the dark with a pencil flashlight in your teeth. They did not turn over any of that.
That early interview told us, look, there's stuff that's not being turned over.
We would be in hearings, and all of a sudden the prosecutor would get up to question a witness about a piece of a document. He would hand the witness and we would look at it. We'd never seen it before.
They uncovered evidence that the police had withheld evidence even from their own experts in an effort to get an expert opinion that they liked.
Well, the footprints were a big deal in the 1987 investigation. There were police officers who were all excited about this Tom McCann print. And the Tom McCann shoe, they're clearly grown man, adult, business casual shoes. They are not tennis shoes. They're not something 15-year-old kids would wear. The bottoms of them had a very specific Tom McCann impression. In fact, one of the shoe prints has the little emblem. It says Tom McCann in the actual field. The actual Tom McCann print was within a couple of feet of where the actual blood trail started. Clearly the person who was involved in at least disposing of the body. They seized all of Tim's shoe. There were no Tom McCann's. His father didn't own any. It got buried at trial because the trial attorneys testified that they never received the FBI photos that would have shown the consistent pattern of these prints, and the police never submitted to the FBI photos of the Tom McCanns.
Broderick in his delusional How the World Works According to Jim Broderick, which is, I think still exists, is if it hurts your case but you're not going to bring it up, then it's your secret file. As I would bring up something saying, well, where's this, where that? Well, he'd bring up a little piece of it that would say, no, this is how that happened. But under the rules of disclosure, you're supposed to turn it all over. You're not supposed to have any of it. You know who's supposed to have it all? Tim's lawyers. That's the problem. That was the issue.
They uncovered evidence relating to an alternate suspect had been destroyed by the police department.
Well, Dr. Hammond, he became an alternate suspect in our mind because what had happened in his case was that he and his wife would have college girls stay over at their house, would have them stay in a specific room, would use a specific bathroom. And with this one college girl, she testified that she was in the bathroom and she kept hearing the zzz, 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 sort of the camera noise. And she looked down into the grate in front of the toilet and she saw a camera lens. They went to the room that was adjacent to the bathroom to figure out what the heck is in there, and they found this media room of like 3 or 4 cameras set up and these videotapes. In fact, in the camera was her name already imprinted on a videotape, her name with the dates that she was going to be there. He had professional equipment. He was sending out data, who knows what, to countries like Germany, the Netherlands, countries that are known for their pornography. He was an ophthalmic surgeon. That's very intricate surgery when you're working with the eyes. That was a big deal to us because here you've got Tim Masters, who they're saying, oh, he's got all these writings and these drawings of these horrible, impactful, violent scenes. Well, wait a minute, you got Dr. Richard Hammond actually producing pornography and producing videotapes. What he would do is he would watch the video and they actually have him logging down plus clit shot, plus minus. You've got Peggy Hetrick, whose nipple was excised and whose vaginal area was surgically excised, the hood. You got the guy actually producing the stuff that he's interested in. Then you got Tim Masters, Freddy Krueger doodles and war scenes. You give all this to a jury, who do you think the jury is going to be more convinced is a likely suspect?
I hear he had some political connections with the country club crowd.
This prosecutor Gilmore, the same guy who prosecuted Tim, had been to this doctor's house before for cocktails. His wife went to the same church as Dr. Hammond's wife. Most people who have sexual offenses have to go through a bondsman, they get arrested, they get booked into jail. This guy got special service, right? He was able to sign out immediately to a mental health hospital. He gets out 2 days later after his psych hold and kills himself.
So, yes, how does he all of a sudden forget about Hammond when the Timothy Masters case is unfolding? Good question. I think we all know the answer. They didn't care. Nobody was going to let facts or evidence get in the way of their conclusion. And their conclusion was Timothy Masters killed Peggy Hetrick damn facts, damn the evidence, don't mess up the storyline, take those minute pieces of information that would corroborate that, embellish them, and then discount everything else.
I didn't know anything about Richard Hammond. None of the jurors knew anything about being a member of the community. I knew who Richard Hammond was and what he had done. I had no idea where he lived in proximity to where they found Peggy. So one of the main reasons I approached Jim Broderick was I asked him what happened to all these videotapes that Richard Hammond had been taken of the genital areas of girls in the house. And Broderick said, well, I said, who destroyed them? And he said, I did. And I said, there's like 200 tapes. Why would you destroy all these tapes? And he said, to protect the victims. And I was like, by destroying them, you removed their right for justice.
There's really two things as a prosecutor. I want to be absolutely sure that I'm convinced the person committed the crime, and then two, that we have sufficient evidence to try to convince a jury. I probably would have to say I was convinced from the very beginning that he was the killer.
Jolene Blair acts as Gilmore's co-counsel.
The most compelling argument for me was, who else could it possibly be? Nobody else had a motive. Nobody else had the opportunity. Nobody else had the weapons. This is the guy.
No one else could have done this. Who else could have done this? As if Tim was the only person with the motive or the opportunity to kill Peggy Hetrick. And yet we now know, the evidence shows, that number one, Tim didn't do it, and number two, there was a whole host of other people that were more likely suspects.
It was actually a really strange time for the community as a whole. Linda Holt was a woman who worked in an office in downtown Fort Collins. They found her sometime later at a local reservoir, and she'd been tied to a tree and killed. Then Mana Hughes was a young mother. She and her husband moved out here from the Midwest because they thought this would be a safer place to raise their family. And they found her body by the side of the highway. They were eventually connected to another local teenager, Donnie Long.
They had secured the arrest warrant for Donnie Long. So I walk in, Donnie Long's there. I said, "You're under arrest." He says, "For what?" I said, "Murder." And he says, "Which one?"
We've got the crazy perverted doctor who lives near the field. We've got the guy who's running around stabbing women who just happen to have similar physical characteristics to Peggy. So there's other suspects, and yet she goes to the jury and says, who else could have done this? No one else could have done this. And that was wrong. It makes you wonder, were they trying to solve this case, or were they merely trying to convict Tim?
And finally, the straw that broke the camel's back was a new DNA technique employed upon some of the clothes that Peggy Hetrick was wearing that proved quite conclusively that Tim was not involved.
You're likely to leave DNA if you exert a lot of force onto clothing. We decided, let's at least give it a shot. So they tested key areas where there would have been force, not normal, just casual touching, but actual force application, and they found DNA.
And it did not, none of it matched Masters.
Right.
We were on lockdown. It was a Friday. My case manager came up to my cell door. He told me, "Tim, your lawyer just called and she really wants to talk to you, but we're on lockdown, so I can't get you out. I'll get you out to call her, though, as soon as the lockdown clears." Like, okay, thanks for nothing. A little while later, he comes back up. He says, "Tim, your lawyer just called again, and she really wants to talk to you. I'm going to try and get you out to call her back." I'm like, okay, thanks. And then 4 o'clock rolls around, the news starts up, and somebody hollers up, "Masters, you're on the news." I'm like, okay, what channel? Channel 9. So I turn to Channel 9, and that's where I hear the announcement.
What did you feel at that moment?
You know what? I didn't believe it. The special prosecutors vacated the sentence against me and released me on a personal recognizance bond. A week later, they announced that they were dismissing the case and filed a motion to dismiss all charges against me.
Who are you most happy to see?
I think my sister. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had, I'd called her from Buena Vista, and she says, yeah, I just heard, but I got bad news. I have jury duty that week. So it's like, oh, great, the system's screwing us over again. And then somehow she got out of the jury duty, and she showed up at the courthouse when I was released. So that was pretty cool.
I think Tim was very overwhelmed. You go from being in a prison system for 9.5 years into just thrust into the, thrusted back into society. So many wonderful people came out and like donated furniture to him, donated stuff, gave him money, just out of the goodness of their heart. And so he has his bed, and it's a queen size bed, but he'll only sleep on one side of it and wouldn't move because your body is just so acclimated to not having the freedom to move on a bed. I mean, one of the things he just kind of had not remembered how much brighter, he said, society was. He's like, I don't remember all these bright lights in stores. I don't remember all these bright things. It was a sensory overload.
Sherry John was a state representative that contacted me about speaking at the state capitol to testify for DNA collection and preservation. And so I went to the state capitol. Tim was sitting right in front of me, and he got up and spoke, and he left to go upstairs to speak, and I followed him out the door, and I touched him on the shoulder, and I shook his hand, and I said, Tim, I'm Tom Turner, and I'm sorry. And he said, okay, we'll have to talk later because I need to get upstairs. And once I did that, and I testified for the preservation of the DNA, because ultimately that's what got Tim out, I've done my part. There's nothing more I can do to make this right for Tim.
In essence, what happened was a grand jury met and looked at Jim Broderick's testimony in the Tim Masters trial and compared it to the facts and the evidence that were in the possession of Jim Broderick, and came to the conclusion that he lied. They listed 9 specific counts where Broderick had committed perjury. So without 2 of them, the prosecutor could still prosecute him for the other 7. That he's choosing not to do that is troubling. The prosecutor is saying, well, I don't want to prosecute him because I don't know there's enough evidence to support a conviction. And that's the great irony here, because they prosecuted Tim Masters for murder with no evidence. We have evidence against Broderick. We just don't think it's enough to prosecute him. It's a strange world where you have these different imbalances.
Has Julian Blair ever apologized?
No.
Has Terry Gilmore?
Nope.
Has Jim Broderick?
Nope.
What do you think is the reason?
I think that those 3 have convinced themselves that they did nothing wrong.
I think it's a protective system for themselves, all right? I mean, you don't want to be the guy who framed a kid for murder. So your protective shell says, your cop hunch or I did the right thing, I mean, I don't know. That's kind of where it goes. I mean, these guys are never going to admit they're sorry or they did wrong. Because otherwise, I think it would be very destructive to their inter-id. And I think they're a little bit too old to be messing with that thing.
I think people generally should be very skeptical of government, of power, of authority. We've become so complacent in our society. We've become so accustomed to the bad guys recycling. We want to cut corners. We want to skirt the rules so that we can get this bad guy in prison as fast as we can and with as little expense as necessary. The reason our founding fathers set up our system based on a presumption of innocence, this mythical standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt, was to safeguard against these kinds of travesties. This case highlights all of the potential errors that can go wrong in our justice system that did go wrong. I think it exemplifies the system of checks and balances where the balances don't work and the checks aren't functional. I mean, you talk about an absolute meltdown from the initial officers on the scene all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court, everybody failing to do their job, and the result was Tim Masters sat in prison for 10 years.
All right. Thank you very much for watching. And it's always nice to revisit this movie because I think it has a lot of important things to say. And sorry, let me make sure I have good audio here. So I'd like to start by talking about some of the lessons from this movie, because I've had a lot of people ask, well, what can we do to prevent wrongful convictions like this, or the sort of abuses of the criminal justice system that Troy Krenning was talking about at the end of the movie. If everyone can hear me all right here. So there are three important things that I would say that each of you watching as an individual can do to prevent injustices like this. And so the first one is to really know what your rights are as a citizen. I hope you'll take away from this documentary that we can't always trust those in power to have our best interests at heart. Very often that's the case that they do, but you can't take that as a guarantee, or you can't take it for granted. So you have to be your own best advocate and your own best defender of liberty. Understand your rights as a citizen of your town, of your state, as an American citizen. And there's plenty of great resources online for that. So really understand what your rights are and stand up for them. The second thing is that it's really important to vote on things like DAs, the retaining of judges, and sheriffs. That's your opportunity to have a say about who is involved in law enforcement and in the judicial system. You may have heard recently that there was a huge scandal at the very highest levels of Colorado's judicial system, all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And they had paid a huge sum of money to somebody to prevent them from filing a tell-all lawsuit about abuses they saw among judges at that high level. So, when you get your ballot for the election season, it's very common to just look at the DA is up for election. You don't know anything about them, or the judges. This vote to retain or don't vote at all. But that's your opportunity. If you research that, that's your opportunity to have a say in who's in charge. It's a chance to put good people in those positions and to keep bad people out of those positions. And it really is. So in the Tim Masters case, it was actually Troy Krenning. He led the campaign to get Gilmore and Blair off the bench, and so more civic engagement of that sort is a very powerful tool in preventing injustices like this. The last thing I'll mention is the importance of jury duty. Many people just see it as nothing more than an inconvenience, but jury duty is your opportunity to have a say, to have a voice within the justice system. And it's very important. There's many countries where we don't get that. People don't get that opportunity. But I would say if it does come up, take it seriously. And if you can be part of that process, I'd encourage you to do so. It's your opportunity to apply your reasoning and your opinions in the judicial system. So those are the three things I'd mention, and I think those are good things because those are things that you can do just on your own, and I really do think each of them makes an important difference. Second, I wanted to talk about cool. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was a few frequently asked questions. When I show this movie, there's a few things that always get asked, and so I just like to answer those. I'll preface this by saying that if you're interested in the Tim Masters case or the murder of Peggy Hetrick, I highly recommend you read Tim Masters' memoir, Drawn to Injustice, which he co-wrote with Steve Lado. You can get it at fine bookstores everywhere. You can order it online. It has far more information than I was able to include in my documentary. But that's a tremendous resource. So one question that often gets asked is what's happened to Masters since his exoneration. I can tell you that he, in many ways, he's done better than a lot of people who are wrongfully convicted. He was very fortunate that he got a sizable settlement from the city of Fort Collins and from Larimer County. It was a considerable sum, and I point that out because not everyone's so lucky. I remember a story of someone who was wrongfully convicted, spent many years in prison, and when he was freed, and he wasn't suspected of the crime anymore, the correction system actually sent him a bill. They wanted him to pay them back for the time and money it took to incarcerate him. So, unfortunately, it's very often the case that people who are wrongfully convicted, they get nothing, or in the case of one person, they get a bill for the money it took to incarcerate them. So Masters was fortunate in that area. He does still live in Colorado, but he just tries to. He very much wants to kind of move on with his life and pursue other things. Let's see here. Another question that often gets asked: what is the official position on Dr. Hammond? What do the police really think about him? Well, some years ago, Dr. Hammond's widow gave the police an envelope, and she said that Dr. Hammond had licked the stamp on the envelope. It was either that or it was the seal on the envelope. They tested that envelope, and that DNA did not match any that was found on Peggy Hetrick. Now, whether or not his DNA was actually on the envelope is another matter. Another thing I'd point out is that, of course, Dr. Hammond would get women from CSU to house sit for him while he was on vacation. And I know that, and so from what I've read, it was actually Dr. Hammond's wife who would put the ads in the newspaper to bring those women in. Another question that often gets asked is about, whose DNA did the DNA that was found on Peggy Hedrick match anybody? The answer is yes. They found DNA of her ex-boyfriend, who was the last person to see her alive at the Prime Minister Bar in Fort Collins, and they were seen arguing at the bar the night that she died. He has never been officially a suspect in the case, however, so officially the murder of Peggy Hedrick does remain unsolved. Let's see. Another thing that I was going to point out was, let's see here. We had talked about that. I guess I'd talk about one other aspect of how shoddy the legal work was in this case, and there were so many things that if they had been brought up, I really think I could have gotten Tim Masters acquitted, or I think the case could have gone better. So as you know, Tom Turner was one of the jurors. It later turned out that Tom Turner knew the Masters family. Like, he was friends with Master, not with Master specifically, but he had a very large family, and he was friends with some of them. And it just so happened that they were at a barbecue, like the summer after the conviction. And he mentioned that he had been on a jury case, and that it was Tim Masters, and like everyone at the table turned to him like, "What? You were on the jury? And like, how could you do that to Tim Masters?" And so the fact that didn't come up in the jury selection, that's very odd. And that's an interesting thing with this case. There's a reputation, of course, that that the public defenders are overworked. They've got 40 different cases open, and they can't. That you're not going to get a really good defense with a public defender, and that's something that's a big plot point in the movie 12 Angry Men, for example. But the truth is that that's not always the case. And actually, Dave Wymore and Mary Lou have said that had Masters gotten a public defender from the Fort Collins area, he probably would have had a better case, or he would have had a better defense, because they would have known the workings of the legal system in Fort Collins, and would have known sort of the ins and outs, and known who to talk to, known who to interview. But he went with some private attorneys from Denver who didn't know anything about how things worked in Fort Collins. So that's another interesting. So some very much a misconception that public defenders always equal bad legal work. In this case, it could have meant a better defense for him. So let's see here. With that in mind, I think I'll answer some of these questions here. Do you know? So Shelley Bernhardt asks, do you know who the first officers were on the case? I can't say specifically. I do believe that one of them was Linda Wheeler, who went on to join the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and she worked. She was someone who worked very hard on convicting Tim Masters. I had wanted to interview her very much. I tried to reach out, but didn't have a lot of success. Later in her career, she became convinced of Tim Masters' innocence, and she worked very hard on getting him released. So I think that's an interesting story. But let's see here. Another question we talked about, is anyone still working on the case? Yes, it is still under investigation by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. And lastly, we talked about the collected DNA. And let's see here. Well, it looks like there's one question here. What was the last piece of this investigation? DNA and So yes, that was the crucial part, that they did this research, this touch DNA, that you leave, that when you touch something, you leave DNA. So you test for DNA in places where they knew the body had been touched. Since the body had been dragged through a field, they touched like under here where the body may have been dragged, and none of the DNA, that was taken in that way matched Tim Masters. And given how heinous this murder was, DNA would have been left in some fashion. But so that really was the piece, and that is, I think, a big part of why the Colorado, the lead attorney, the Attorney General for Colorado, took the very unusual step of exonerating Tim Masters. That's very unusual in the criminal justice system, that someone is basically declared innocent, that they're exonerated of a crime. For the most part, you're acquitted, which simply means you're not found guilty. So, and it's sort of interesting because there's also, I think this documentary speaks to another misconception about like the ability, the limits of really like trying to analyze like the criminal mind, which is the subject of so many TV shows and so many movies, that you can look at a letter or you can look at a drawing and gain this insight into somebody's mind. For the most part, that's really not science. Although, unfortunately, because of the state Supreme Court ruling on the Tim Masters case, that is the law in Colorado, that kind of evidence, like that you can look at the drawing and have some opinion about the mind of the person who made it, like that is, unfortunately, that evidence is admissible in court in Colorado. So I remember when I was screening this movie in its early stages to colleagues, and we looked at, we came to the part where we show some of the drawings, and one of my colleagues said, we'll just look at those drawings. This is obviously someone who's really disturbed, or they are really violent, and maybe they did do it. And I was just really surprised by that there's no physical evidence against Tim Masters, but there's something about the drawings that they provoke a very powerful emotional reaction in people, and that leads people to be very quick to judgment. I hope that you take away from this movie, there's a huge difference between somebody who says, well, I think about doing this, or I think about this thing, and the person who says, I am going to do this. I think a lot of other movies and TV shows make it look like that gap is much narrower than it actually is. It's actually a very considerable gap. When I was making this documentary, I was reading Stephen King's memoir called On Writing, kind of about his life and what led to his books. And, the kind of stuff that Stephen King was writing when he was a kid, it's really not that different. It's also, I thought it was sort of interesting that this, it's similar to another wrongful conviction case that took place in the Midwest. It was the subject of a very good documentary series called Paradise Lost. I think they made 3 movies in that series, and it was about a girl who'd been murdered, and they charged these teenagers who lived in town. And essentially, the evidence in that case was that because these kids wore black clothing and they listened to heavy metal, that they, because they were sort of the outsiders in the community, clearly they were involved in some sort of satanic cult, and they had to have done it. And later it was proven that they had nothing to do with the crime. The documentaries actually helped secure their freedom because one of the people they interviewed all but confessed to doing it. So I do hope that that's something you take away from this, that there, it's fun to speculate about, to look at a drawing and what were they thinking, and does this relate to something that happened in their life. but that's a lot more illusory than you might think. So, I guess that's all that I really wanted to talk about, and if that's it for questions, I would just thank you for watching, and I do hope I can screen this again later this year. I'm going to talk for a little bit more, and I'll see if any other questions come in, but otherwise, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a good night. I do plan to stream next week. I'll be talking more about updates to my Nantucket ebook platform. But anyway, thank you so much, and I hope you have a nice weekend. Let's see, what else could I talk about? Just waiting for a few other questions. Let's see, I was going to talk a little bit about some of the process of making the movie, because this was a very low-budget affair. It was largely just me making it with the help of a few people on the camera and post-production side. One of the challenges I had was getting footage, because this was going to be a movie that I was going to show at theaters and on streaming, and I had to really think about, I had to make sure that I had the copyright for all the footage that I showed, that I had legal clearance to show it. Because if you don't have that, you can be sent a cease and desist letter. And so for this movie, I had to do a lot of homework on each clip that I showed, and finding clips that I was free to use or that I had a legitimate grounds under fair use to use. And actually, that was a very rewarding process of going through the research on that. And what I found is that if you really dig deep and you do your research, you can find material that will help you, that you can use legally. You can search Creative Commons, works in like the Internet Archive, works that are in the public domain. For example, a lot of the I used a lot of educational films from the 60s and 70s and edited them together, and those were, for those the copyright had expired, or just finding images online. It took quite a bit of time, but when I released the movie, I had the confidence of knowing that I was within my rights to use all that footage. So if there's any filmmakers watching, it is within the realm of possibility. It also helped that I did my own music for the movie. But let's see. I guess another thing I would talk about was Dr. Reed Malloy. If people were curious about more about him, and the psychologist to the stars, as Maria Liu talked about it. I was reminded of, as far as Dr. Malloy goes, I remember being at a bookstore north of San Diego, which is really, they have all these old books. I always love going there. I was up in that bookstore, and I had mentioned I was making this movie, and there was this psychologist who just made rampant speculations about things, and the owner of the bookstore said, "Oh yeah, he comes in now and then, and I see him." And so I was like, "Oh wow, that was a weird connection." So Dr. Malloy, to give you some sense of his practice, his big case that really propelled him to stardom and made him a psychologist of the stars was about a guy named Ricardo Lopez, who was a stalker of Bjork, the singer, and he had sent a mail bomb to her in an attempt to kill her. Fortunately, the bomb was intercepted in time and no one had been hurt. And so Ricardo Lopez had made this very extensive video diary of his process of, about his obsession with Bjork and the process of making the bomb. And so Dr. Malloy had been brought in to give his opinion on this case, which I think was a tad superfluous, because by the end of this video diary, the stalker is like wearing this bloody face paint, and he's building this bomb, and every inch of his apartment is covered in pictures of Bjork. And then you have Dr. Malloy saying, well, in my opinion, this guy was obsessed and was disturbed. And it's sort of like, well, I'm glad that you pointed that out. Yeah. So I know that was his big case initially and why he was brought in. But it's the law in Colorado that any of you watching, if you're in Colorado, if you can go go to a trial if you're asked, and you can be sworn in, look at a drawing, and give your opinion on it without having to meet the person, without having any qualifications. You can just go in and say, well, and here's my opinion on the state of mind of the person who made this drawing. Anyone can do that. I remember there was a Q&A I gave at the CU Law School, and Dave Wymore was there, and he said that the Colorado Supreme Court ruling on the use of drawings and rampant speculation in the Tim Masters case, the Supreme Court ruling from Colorado about that, he said that was the worst court decision since Dred Scott. And so that gives you some idea of how serious that is. But anyway, those are just some other notes about it. And I would be interested to talk a little bit more about this movie at a later date. It was very nice talking with all of you, and I hope you found the movie enjoyable. And thank you again for all of your questions. So everyone have a good night.